So about a month ago, I hit 1,000 subscribers on this YouTube channel, and it seems to be a bit of a YouTube convention that when you hit 1,000 subscribers, you do a question and answer session. So I posted out on my email newsletter and on my Twitter for anybody to ask any questions that they wanted me to answer. And you guys sent a fair few questions in, so I'm going to be going through them in this video. The themes of the questions were some general questions about study and productivity, some questions about kind of learning to code and building technical skills, also thoughts on tech in healthcare, and some questions about careers as well. Talking about data science, talking about changing careers, that sort of thing. I'll leave some timestamps in the description, so feel free to hop around if you want to. So the first question is, could you share how you decide what kind of information to retain? Clearly the cost of memory is time. We need to make notes, spaced repetition to remember things, and that means we will have less time for other things, particularly pertinent to multidisciplinary professionals. Yeah, so this is a great question. I think one of the things I found, and I still find most challenging about working kind of at the moment as like a dual professional. So right now I'm working both as a medical doctor and also full-time as a data scientist. It is tricky to keep up the knowledge in both areas. There's some things I found that have kind of been helpful with this. So I would say one principle that has been really helpful is the idea of trying to build up like a foundation of understanding in any particular area, and particularly for that foundation to have the kind of overall structure, to see the trees. And I really like this analogy, which I've heard a few people talk about. I think I've heard Elon Musk mention it, and I've heard Tim Urban from the blog Wait But Why mention this, which is that you want to build a tree trunk of like, what is the structure of this knowledge, and then you want to add those kind of leaves on so you have the details. So rather than just diving into a subject and maybe learning about a particular area, let's say in medicine, just learning about the different types of like musculoskeletal diseases, you want to ask, how do we classify them, what's the overall structure of these diseases, and then use that to then kind of hang those details on. So whenever I'm approaching a new topic, a new subject, I always want to look for that initial kind of structure, and that's what I'll prioritize initially, because then if I then don't cover that area for a while, because maybe I'm focusing on data science stuff, or maybe I'm working medical stuff and I'm not doing as much data science, then I can always kind of come back and pick that up more quickly. I think that would probably be my top piece of advice. And the second piece of advice would be about being disciplined with kind of learning and doing things like spaced repetition. So as obviously the person who asked this question is already aware of that, if you're not, spaced repetition is basically a principle whereby you cover material and then you cover it again at a smaller interval, and then kind of increasingly longer intervals you recover that same material, so it stays fresh in your mind over time. And I think if you do that and you do maintain that, then it's extremely helpful, and that helps you to keep a lot of knowledge in your head over a long period of time. It is, I find, always easier said than done, but as best as possible, I try and kind of use that system, and I think when I do, I definitely remember things much better and kind of keep what feels like a broader base of knowledge in my head. So yeah, those would probably be the two main answers to that question. Okay, next question. I watched your videos on studying techniques and prioritization. They were great. Okay, thank you. Just thought it would be interesting to hear from you on a more macro perspective. You talked about daily prioritization, but how do you decide, for example, how much medical knowledge to retain? This is, I guess, similar to the question before, but the main thing I would add to that is, yeah, in terms of deciding what to learn, obviously you want to identify what the core information that you need to know in a particular subject is. So what's the most useful things to learn about? And I wrote about this recently on my weekly email newsletter about identifying what are those kind of core subjects that you need to nail down. And I think for any subject, you want to be able to find out what those are. There's a book called Ultra Learning, which actually talks a bit about this and suggests various techniques. So for example, looking on Reddit and trying to see what are the kinds of things that people talk about as core subjects. Like Reddit tends to be a pretty good resource to go to if you just want to see, I'm trying to learn something new. What do I need to know as like the core within that area? Then Reddit, there'll be like different threads on learning that subject, and people will talk about that. So that's a pretty useful resource. Another thing that I found useful, and I particularly used at medical school, was asking myself, so basically at medical school, I set myself the aim of, I want to come in the top 25% of the year, but I'm not like too fussed about coming much above that. I'm not trying to aim to be like the top student. I just want to be in the top 25%, because that seems like a pretty fair sort of bar to aim at. And I would use that to prioritize, because then if I ever came across new study material or studying like a subject and there was lots of different material and I was trying to figure out how deep to go, I would just ask myself, is this the kind of information that somebody who's finishing in the top 25% would know? And if it was like, no, I think this is like a top 5%, top 10% kind of thing, then I would be pretty chill about saying, okay, it's interesting, but I'm not going to focus on making sure I know that. Okay, let me just get into the door.
A few moments later.
And likewise, if there was something that, I thought like most of the year should know this, like top 50% will all know this information, then yeah, I'll definitely like make sure I knew that and I kind of memorize that well. So yeah, that's a kind of framework that I used to try and guide how much I should learn about particular subjects, because in any subject, I think in medicine, machine learning, data science, whatever, there's always like so much you can learn. It's pretty endless, to be honest. So yeah, you have to prioritize. That's something I found helpful, but I think it's important just to try and find out what that core information is. Okay, next question. I want to hear about your personal knowledge management system. Yeah, fine. So I know this obviously is a kind of hot topic in productivity. People, are trying out all these new different systems. You have like Notion and Roam, particularly at the moment, are kind of taking off and doing pretty well. I might make a video in future detailing the system. I guess just to give you an overview at the moment, I use quite a few different platforms. So I use Notion, Evernote, and OneNote as probably the three main places that I store information, and I store slightly different things in each one. In OneNote is where I keep a lot of my kind of material on things that I learn that I'm going to refer to. And in my productivity series that I recorded on this channel about a year ago, I kind of went through how I build up notes on a particular topic in Evernote and have like one note dedicated to one topic that then I will build on and refer to over time. So that's probably my go-to place for that. And then Notion is a little bit different. So I'm using it now more for certain courses that I'm doing where I want to frame it in a kind of question-driven way. There's quite a few courses I've done recently where I just felt that it would be more useful to do it in that sort of structure. So I've been using Notion, I've been playing around with that. And to be honest, just the aesthetics of Notion is pretty nice as well, and probably nicer than OneNote. And then I do also use Evernote, which is probably the main location of my second brain. Using the building the second brain concept from Tiago Forte, if you're not familiar with that. And I use all the things that they recommend. So I have Instapaper. If I see an article on the internet, I'll instantly put that into Instapaper. I pretty much read all of my articles on Instapaper, and then I have the highlights from that going into Evernote, and then I'll kind of review and update those notes. So that's all the written content. I think for listening, I just use Spotify, and as soon as I see a podcast that I'm interested in, I just download it on my phone, and then at some point I'll listen to that. I think that's about it. So any more specific questions on that, leave them in the comments and I will respond to those. Cool, so yeah, that's it for productivity and studying. The next section of questions is learning to code. So the first question is, so what advice would you give to those on their coding journey when it comes to the growing number of no-code tools and the hopeful democratization of AI capabilities? Would you say it's now more important to focus on fundamental concepts rather than learning to actually code? Great question. I think obviously we're seeing more and more no-code tools being developed, and they have kind of an increasing amount of capability. There's more and more things you can do with no-code tools. Ultimately, I think it depends on what you want to do. So I'm not too sure what the background of the person who asked this question was. But yes, definitely there's more and more no-code tools, and there's more that you can do without coding. And I think this sort of mirrors the early days of like web development. So you used to have like HTML, CSS, and people would make kind of websites and frameworks in those, and they'd learn those languages. Whereas now you have things like WordPress and Squarespace and these other websites, which essentially are no-code solutions to making websites. Now, would you still consider it useful to be able to code HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for websites? I think a lot of people would argue yes. I think it's in a slightly different way. So it's no longer the case that you would want to build websites from scratch. And even if you know how to code in these languages, you're probably still going to use a framework of some sort. But then actually being able to read those, being able to understand those languages and be able to read them does then help you to manipulate those websites. So in terms of should you learn to code versus using no-code solutions, right now I still think that it makes sense to learn to code if it's relevant for you. So I'll come on in a second to talk about, does it make sense for you as an individual to learn to code? Because I think it does depend on what you're planning to do and how you might use code in your work or in the kind of projects you're working on. Does it make sense to code given no-code tools? The reason I think it does is because if you are serious about building something with code, you don't want to be constrained by what the current tools enable you to do. And right now, there's some pretty cool tools out there. I played around with a tool called Orange, and it lets you train machine learning models, it lets you manipulate data, and it's a lot easier to do that than it is by writing code, but there's limitations to that. And I personally think those limitations are still going to exist going forward for the foreseeable future, that it would still be useful for you to learn the principles of coding. And even if you're using a no-code solution, knowing how to code will be helpful for you. So in summary, yes, I do still think it is worth learning how to code, just so you can go outside of those boundaries that you're going to be put in if you only use no-code solutions. Now, the bigger question though is actually, in your individual case, does it make sense to learn to code? And this is something that I'm actually currently writing a blog on, so once I finish that blog, I'll leave a link in the description. So the second part of the question is, should you learn to code given your particular circumstance? And I think it really depends on what you want to do. Let's say you are a medical researcher and you're interested in doing research that uses AI. do you need to learn how to code? I know a lot of medical researchers who are doing world-leading AI-based research and have never written a line of code in their life. So I don't think it's essential if you're doing research, because you will be with other people in your team who have that kind of machine learning and programming skills that they'll basically do that for you. But let's consider another scenario. So let's say that you are interested in contributing to some sort of tool that applies technology to healthcare and helps some sort of health problem. I think here is where it does start to become useful to be able to know how to code, because knowing how to code can help you to understand what's possible. It can also help you to maybe develop an early stage prototype. But it is still likely in that circumstance that you actually could find people to collaborate with and maybe find other people with technical skill. And I think here you can start making the argument of understanding the principles rather than actually understanding how to code it. Knowing how to code is definitely a useful part of it, but the truth is, unless you're doing some coding full time and really kind of going into that, then you're not going to be at the level where you can code solutions to a high enough standard that they can actually be like implemented in real life. There is a kind of balance between understanding the principles and actually learning how to code. And I think there's definitely some overlap between the two, because learning to code will teach you the principles, and to learn the principles, often you'll learn how to code. So I don't think the answer is just to learn how to write the code, and I don't think the answer is just to learn the principles, because they kind of go hand in hand. There's a really great course that I think covers both of these to the right sort of level, and that is the CS50 course by Harvard, which they stream every year onto YouTube. So I'll leave a link in the description. If you watch the CS50 course, that will give you like a fantastic overview of both principles, but also some of the syntax of how the code's written. That doesn't mean you actually would then need to go and look to write the code yourself, but even just having that basic understanding would be very helpful, I think. That was kind of a long-winded answer. I hope that answered the question there. But yeah, CS50 is a great course, so definitely check that out. When you're working as a doctor and learning to code for 3 to 4 hours after work, how were other points in your life? For example, health, money, making dinner, and the all-important, your relationship with the missus. Yeah, great question. The first thing that comes to mind when I read this question is a blog post by James Clear that I read maybe a year ago or so. And he basically made the case that there's like 4 different domains of life. And I think they were health, work, relationships, and a fourth one that I can't, maybe it was friendships. And I think he had friendships and relationship as 2 separate ones, just because, you can obviously spend a lot of time in one and not in the other. And he basically made the case that you cannot maximally be, succeeding or doing well in all 4 of these domains at the same time, simultaneously. We just don't have the bandwidth to do really well in all of those. So at any point in time, you can max out on maybe 1 or 2. I can't remember, I think he maybe said you could do 2 out of 4 at a time to like a high level. If you're maxing out on 2, you're going to be kind of neglecting the other ones to some extent. And I do think there's some truth to this, but I would say the approach that I've tried to take is to be as efficient as possible to enable you to focus on all of these areas, and also not to try and max out on any particular area. So for example, when I was learning to code, I think I was doing about 1 evening a week and then 1 session on the weekend, where I would just spend 3-4 hours of like focus time on some sort of coding problem or completing some sort of course online. Definitely, I could have learned faster. I could have devoted more time to it, and I would have made quicker progress with learning to code. But I was happy to make that slow and steady progress by just carving out that time and like not doing anything beyond that. So outside of that time, I wouldn't really be learning to code in any serious sense. I would maybe read like the odd blog or book kind of casually alongside that. I think this sort of like segmenting of different aspects of my life was something that was helpful. There's a lot to be said for just kind of sustained, slow and steady progress. It was definitely frustrating at times when I felt I wasn't really learning that fast, or I just still didn't quite get it. But eventually, after you spend enough time, then things just start to kind of flow, and it feels amazing, and you get that like positive feedback. But I think it takes a lot of time to get to that point. Another thing I would do, as well as making sustained, slow and steady progress, is I would have kind of like short bursts of intensity. So for the coding thing, I would, go to hackathons, or like have a weekend or a stretch of several days where I would just submerge myself into some sort of task, try and kind of go deeper, build on the stuff that I've been learning over the last few months, and kind of try and really actively level things up in that period. So now a couple of questions about technology and healthcare. Would love to know what your personal opinion is on what parts of the NHS or any health system will become heavily powered by AI and ML over the next 25 years. I have relatively low expectations of the amounts that AI and machine learning will be implemented into the NHS, and probably other healthcare systems as well, although there'll be a bit of variation, because there's definitely a pyramid of using tech to improve healthcare. And At the bottom, you just have like well-functioning tech platforms, electronic notes, being able to access all the blood tests and imaging and everything on kind of platforms that integrate well together. That's kind of your fundamental. And then above that, maybe you have interesting data science tools and analysis and research you can do using that collected data. And really, AI and machine learning is very much the top of that iceberg. Based on the current evidence, like, we are not doing a great job of those bottom rungs in the NHS, so I can't see a huge widespread use of AI and ML. Obviously 25 years is a long time, so I might be wrong. Maybe things will progress and we'll have a lot of quick progress in that area, but I'm not hopeful of that right now, and I think there's not a lot of evidence pointing in that direction. That being said, I can see certain use cases where AI and ML could get implemented. So I think we've already seen a lot of promising things around radiology and ophthalmology and algorithms being used for diagnostic purposes or for screening purposes, triaging in those sorts of settings. And I think we could feasibly take these standalone tools and integrate them into our clinical workflow. And that is something I could see happening in the next 25 years. But I struggle to see it on like a widespread sense in all different specialties across the NHS. Another area which I think often gets overlooked, where I do think there will be a lot of useful AI uses, is around less clinical but more like operational things. So for example, scheduling theatres, scheduling appointments, digitizing medical notes, digitizing doctor's appointments, doing automatic transcription of ward rounds and clinic letters, clinic appointments, and all those sorts of things. That's something where I think concretely we could see a lot of useful AI being used, and it's less dependent on the infrastructure being in place and the data being collected and curated in the right way, or at least the clinical data being collected and curated. I'm aware of a couple of kind of early stage things with that. I think I could see a lot of that in the NHS in 25 years time. Another big trend I expect we'll see is around kind of shifting from hospital-centered care to more remote care. So people having more control over their health data, more control over their health in general, and more tools that are aimed to help people manage their conditions at home, people collecting their own data, and then the AI tools being built using their personal data for them to then use directly. I do think we'll see a lot of that, and it is also less dependent on hospitals collecting and curating their data in the right way, because you can give that option to patients to collect their own data using devices like their smartphones or perhaps other sorts of medical devices, and then you have the data there, and then they can kind of consent to that being used. Do you think that it is more efficient for doctors who want to get involved in bioinformatics/medtech/policy to study maths, data, engineering themselves, or to collaborate with other people with skills in the above fields, so companies, incubators, and NGOs? I think that in general, it is always helpful to know more technical things. So studying math, studying data, studying engineering is definitely a helpful thing. It's not a waste of time. The question is about the trade-off, and where is this balance point at which you're learning enough that it's useful, but you're not learning so much that it's taking up too much time. Because obviously we have infinite amount of time, we have infinite amount of attention and resources. So we don't want to learn more than we would necessarily need to. And the question is specifically asking about doctors. So in general, if you are interested and you have the capacity and the time to go deeper into the technical things, I think it's great, I think it's worth it, and I think it can help you to identify new problems. For these particular areas, bioinformatics, medtech policy, yeah, I think it depends on, even within those areas, there's a lot of variations. So if we're saying bioinformatics, you want to do research, you want to kind of work on developing new drug molecules or work for a pharmaceutical company, in that case, I personally think it would be pretty valuable to be able to understand the maths and the data behind it. That will just help you to understand the research in a much better way and come up with new ideas to help progress that field forward. For other things like medtech, it depends on what sort of medtech thing you're doing. So if, let's say, you're trying to start a company and it's a company based around like a tech platform, but that platform doesn't really use like AI, ML, or anything too technical, then you probably don't need to understand the maths and or study data in like a formal sense. If the solution that you're trying to develop is a bit more focused on something that's quite data heavy, or some sort of machine learning tool being applied, or analyzing data in some sort of way, that's when it probably does become more useful to have a formal understanding in this yourself. You're definitely still going to be collaborating with people who are like more expert in that domain, because as a doctor, you're just never going to be as fully kind of experienced with the kind of maths and data side of things as people who did maths as a degree or computer science and went down that route. But you start moving there towards more towards it being helpful for you to have done some formal study. So yeah, within medtech, it depends on the kind of solution you're working on and the depth to which you're working on that problem. Then for the final one, policy. This one, I'm not too experienced, so I can't give a well-informed opinion on this. I think it depends a bit on the area of policy you're working on. From the sounds of it, you're interested in kind kind of med-techy things. It comes back to the more technical understanding you have, the better off you are, but you only have finite resources. So as much as you can know, I would say. But yeah, sorry, that's a little bit vague, but I hope that's helpful for the question. But I think with all these things, personal preference is definitely a big factor. Are you someone who is quite detail orientated and you are interested in going kind of deep into the weeds and understanding some of the technical details, or are you more interested in a bit more of a big picture overview? Because if you're in the former, I think it makes more sense to go technical and go deeper into that. If you're in the latter, then you might not enjoy that. And ultimately, it probably comes down to what you would enjoy more or less. So now a couple of questions about content creation. What's been your growth strategy thus far? I would say I haven't really had a growth strategy, to be honest. I kind of made the commitment to just publish at least one video every week with no other sort of constraints around that about how long that video is, how much time I spend on that video. I would say broadly that kind of served me well. The main thing it did is it just made me churn out videos. And I think a lot of my early videos were pretty bad from a production value point of view, but just by actually forcing myself to make them and keep on iterating that process, I definitely did improve in terms of production value, in terms of scripting, in terms of knowing what sort of things are interesting to talk about. So next question, how much time do you commit in making each video you upload? It definitely does take a while. So I do all the editing myself, and I would estimate I probably spend maybe 3, 4, 5 hours per video. To be honest, I try not to track it too much because I think it does suck the fun out of it a little bit. Early on, I would say it took me ages to make even my first couple of videos. I spent like probably, I don't know, 5, 6 hours, and it was still pretty rubbish, to be honest. Now I think if it's a video that's pretty straightforward and I know exactly how I'm going to edit it, how I'm going to process that, then yeah, I can do it in less time. Maybe 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours if I'm like pretty rapid. But yeah, it really depends. Any overall thoughts and takeaways thus far on your process and journey? Yeah, I think it's been pretty enjoyable so far. It's quite cool, all the like little unexpected ways in which you benefit from putting yourself out there. Even though I would say the channel is relatively small at this stage, I've still had quite a few people reaching out to me, and I've had various other kind of meetings, coffees, informal job offers, and generally like interesting conversations and opportunities that have come out of making the videos and just putting myself out there. I think the main kind of downside would just be the amount of time investment it takes. So I've really spent a lot of time editing videos. I'm not particularly proud of like a lot of my videos. I think particularly the early ones, they really weren't like that higher standard. If you don't look at it from that point of view and you look at it from the point of view of skill development, then now I'm in a position where I know how to film videos, I know how to edit them to like a pretty decent standard, and that's a useful skill going forward. Now a few careers questions. So how does your current data science role fit in with your machine learning and medicine mission? So right now I'm really focusing on building technical skills. I think I want to be somebody who has both the technical ability as well as the medical experience to be able to actually build these tools to be used in healthcare. So I'm kind of trying to discover my own niche, I guess. I don't know if this really exists as a role at the moment, but I want to be somebody who is excellent at writing the code, at building machine learning models that then apply to healthcare problems. So then if there are research groups who maybe have academics and doctors in their team and they're looking for people to build their machine learning models, I would then be in a pretty good position to do that because I would have the medical insight from working as a doctor and I would have strong technical skills. So that's the plan at the moment. What are your plans after completing this degree? Will you learn other categories of AI or will you find a machine learning related course? I think probably that'll be enough courses for the time being. I think having done my master's degree, that gives me like a really good kind of broad foundation of the different sorts of machine learning approaches and techniques that we're using. I don't think there'll be that much point at this stage to go like too much deeper into that. My plan right now is I'm thinking about starting a startup. So I may well launch that within the next 6 months or so. Probably depending on what that area is. I've got a few different ideas of areas I might work in, but depending on what exactly I do work in, I will then deep dive into that area and probably do courses in that, to be fair, but nothing like more formal or more broad at this stage. And then maybe down the line, yeah, I'm thinking about maybe doing a PhD as well, but not for a couple of years at least. Since your previous degree was non-quantitative, i.e. medicine, what helped you to gain entry into a master's in machine learning at UCL? And was your personal statement mainly about self-initiated projects? There was a few things I did. I built up like kind of project portfolio so that I had a few different concrete projects I could talk about, which were all centered around applying machine learning to healthcare. I wrote a blog post about this before, so I'll leave a link in that in the description. And that kind of talks about the approach that I took to building this portfolio and learning those skills. What I also did, which maybe was a bit unconventional, is I reached out to the course director for the course that I was interested in, this master's degree at UCL, and I basically kind of pitched myself. I said, you know, I'm a medical doctor, so I studied medicine before. I don't have any like formal maths quantitative experience, but I'm really interested in machine learning and I really enjoy maths. Would you consider accepting me on the program? And he said, you know, ideally we would have some sort of evidence of your maths experience, but if you haven't got a degree, then online courses, they're not really like strong evidence. What we could do is I could bring you in, we could do like an interview, I'll give you some maths problems and just see you try and solve them. So then we did that. So I came to his office. He's quite a quite a well-known like professor in machine learning, and he drew up these kind of problems for me on a whiteboard, and I had to then like solve them, and he just watched me solve them, and it was a pretty cool experience. I think at the time he said, I'm quietly optimistic about your potential to do the course, and then like a month or so later I got the offer come through. How to start a career if you're just beginning out. I think I would focus on building projects and on building skills first, rather than thinking of it as like a big career leap. And I would just think of it as like taking little bets. So there's this book called Small Bets or Little Bets, and basically the idea is you're not making a giant leap in one go, you're taking like small steps. So think of like a small project you want to work on, do it, see if you enjoy that project, see what you learn from it, and then if you enjoy it, do like another project, and then do like another project, and then take another online course, and just kind of gradually build up that skill set in the new area you're interested in. And if you keep on enjoying it and you keep on doing more and more, then within a certain period of time, like you'll be ready to take a job in that certain industry. So that's kind of what I did with the data science thing. I basically just did projects and took these kind of small bets for about a couple of years. And then now actually my coding is pretty good and I have enough reference experience that I can work full time in a job as a data scientist. But it definitely took time, and it would have been quite overwhelming to think of it all as like a big leap that I'm trying to kind of engineer. What's your view on the automatability of data scientists? Will this be happening anytime soon? I don't really think data science as a job is going to be automated in the near future. I think there will be more and more advanced tools that you can use, and there will be parts of the analysis that can become more and more automated. But ultimately, the role is kind of to ask the right questions. So the algorithm will answer the questions that you ask, but you have to frame them in the right way and try and solve them in the right way on a higher level. So maybe the role of a data scientist will shift a little bit more away from writing code to working out what the right questions are to answer. So right now, we do both. We think, what questions you want to answer, how can you answer that with code? That will kind of shrink to what questions do we want to answer and how can we do that with kind of no code solutions or with the different tools that are out there. But I personally don't think that we're going to like see a full automation of the data scientist, because there's always going to be more and more data. There's always going to be new questions that we can ask, which there's not going to be like an automated algorithm to figure out those questions. At the point that we do have that, then we're talking about like artificial general intelligence, which I think is a way off. And when we get to that point, we're going to see an automation of a lot of different things. I think data science is going to be relatively late along that kind of pipeline of jobs that will be automated. As you have got the ML and healthcare area down, are there any other sectors you think could be improved or need to be talked about when it comes to ML? For example, conservation or humanitarian work? To be honest, I'm not too sure. I'm fairly focused on machine learning and healthcare. I think pretty much every industry can be impacted by AI. Andrew Ng, who's a kind of big name in AI and machine learning, says that AI is kind of like electricity. So when electricity came around, we had all these new things that you could potentially make. You could start making different appliances, like you made kitchen appliances, fridges, toasters. You had computers. Computers kind of like developed along this whole like pipeline. With AI, maybe it's a similar sort of thing. There's lots of things that AI can enable. A lot of things we probably haven't even thought of yet. And that's going to have a huge impact on all these different industries. Probably wouldn't really know enough to say which sectors need to be talked about more. In healthcare, it does get talked about a lot, and I think it makes sense because there's lots of ways it can be applied in healthcare. But my focus so far has mostly been on healthcare, so it's hard for me to comment too much outside of that. Cool, so that was everything. I know that was kind of a bit rambly, a bit long-winded. It's been a pretty cool experience starting a YouTube channel. I still kind of see it as like an experiment. I'm still very much like learning what I want to do with the platform, what I want to do with the channel. I hope those questions were interesting. If you have any more questions, drop them in the comments below and I will answer those. And I'll see you in the next video.